Conflict, Civility, Respect, Peace, Northeastern Reflects. This is a series that, as you know, is co-organized by the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, the School of Law, and the Office of Student Affairs at the university. And it has faculty as well as staff members from around the campus on the organizing committee. You can read more about the series and also the events that it has done in the past on the website that you can find on your programs. As I start to talk about the impact as well as the purpose of the series, I also want to alert you right away to the fact that we'll have 2 follow-up forums that you'll find in your program following tonight's conversation. This series is designed to elevate civility and ethical reasoning on campus and beyond. Each event has the ambition to trace the arc from recognizing conflict or injustice to building peace. And it's wonderful to see so many of you here today to discuss important issues of our day, including a topic that we want to tackle today, and that is the topic of the kind of civic responsibility that we have in today's world of rapid change. In this context, I want to just alert you to a concept that the organizing committee and this series has often take as a guiding principle, and that is the concept of civic sustainability. Our working definition of civic sustainability has several key features. One is to practice civility while engaging with diverse opinions. Another one is to acknowledge past and present problems. A third is to broaden personal networks, and I hope you'll do a little bit of that during the reception period of our session tonight as well. And the fourth one is to find common ground in social action. We are pursuing these goals, of course, in the framework of what we do best at Northeastern, and that is to combine intellectual rigor in academic research with experiential learning, and also in a framework that always pays attention to both our local context and to our global connections as well. This evening, we are asking broad questions about civic responsibility in a world of rapid change with colleagues from law, philosophy, English, and sociology. They will be asking how we articulate values in a world of dislocation, disaster, and technological change. And they will also be asking, each from different perspectives, of what our responsibilities are to one another in smaller and larger communities. Natural disasters such as the recent hurricanes and wildfires are reminders how important it is that strangers help strangers. And at the same time, they are also important reminders that disaster and recovery and the resources available for recovery can also be very different for different communities. And the question of civic responsibility also comes up when we look at political discourse, when we look at the dangers of division in this country and abroad. In other words, we will have 4 of our colleagues engage with us in a conversation by presenting how they think about civic responsibility with specific contexts and practices in mind. It's then my pleasure to turn first to Bob Jose, who is, and I really want to get this right now, who is Associate Dean of Cultural, Residential, and Spiritual Life, and who will give a few words of welcome to all of you on behalf of Student Affairs.
Good evening, everyone, and on behalf of our Vice President, Madeline Estabrook, and the Division of Student Affairs, I'd like to welcome you to this event. It's a very important event. You know, as I look at the title of our series, Conflict, Civility, Respect, and Peace, Northeastern Reflects, it's always been that part that says Northeastern Reflects that I felt was most important. You know, I sat in a meeting not too long ago with Dr. Philly Mantella, the Senior Vice President here at Northeastern, and she said that over the years she's come to find that one of the most important aspects of leadership was the ability to reflect, to slow down, to take stock and look back. And so every time that we have the opportunity to reflect on the higher, more important issues of our day, it reminds me of just how important the college community is and how blessed we are to have the ability to do this. Our program says, that one of the things we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about how do we articulate values in a world of dislocation, disaster, and technological change. I think many of you know this past weekend we had the Clinton Global Initiative University here. And that question really was answered, I think, with another question quite interestingly. And it was said, you know, what's more important? Our interest in differences and the attendant issues of identity that they bring, or our common humanity? The question was asked. And how we answer that question, well, however we answer it, drives the answer in a lot of the things that we're going to talk about tonight. And I'm glad that we've had the opportunity to sit together and learn something and to be able to learn from each other. It's my hope tonight that we have a night where we'll be able to share ideas and thoughts and learn together. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of my colleagues in Student Affairs, we welcome you. Hope we learned something tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. And it's then my pleasure to introduce Kristen Madison, who is Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Professor of Law, and who's here representing the School of Law.
Thank you, and welcome from the School of Law. As an Associate Dean at the School of Law, I guess I view this series and this event in particular as something that's really at the very heart of the mission of the law school. So just to paraphrase, through our teaching, scholarship, and public service, the school works to promote social justice and enhance understanding of the law's impact on individuals and communities. So understanding the law and promoting social justice are really both critical in a time of and world of rapid change. Why is that the case? Well, it's the case because law governs our interactions with one another. It defines the rights and responsibilities that each of us has, and also defines the responsibilities of our institutions. And so when disasters occur, when technology changes, we may depend on existing law to really help us muddle through, but it also gives us an opportunity to rethink the law and what it's trying to achieve. So if law is well designed and if it's appropriately enforced, it can help us address all of these issues. It can help us resolve conflict and promote civility and encourage respect and maybe even possibly achieve peace. But accomplishing these goals really isn't easy, right? To have effective law, to have law that really functions well, you really have to have an inclusive and thoughtful civic engagement on the part of many different people. And the other thing to keep in mind is that the potential for such engagement is also influenced by the law. And so whenever you talk about civic engagement or whenever you talk about civic responsibility, law is always somewhere lurking in the background. And so I look forward to the thoughts of all of our panelists as well as the audience on these issues. Thank you.
So without further ado, let me turn the microphone over to Nicole Aljo, who is Professor of English as well as African American Studies, and who is our moderator for this conversation, first of the panelists, and then for a lively conversation with all of you in the audience tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Uta, and thank you everyone for joining us. I want to begin by just briefly introducing everyone on the panel, starting with myself and then moving, I guess we'll move this way. So I'm Nicole Aljo, as Uta said. I'm an associate professor of English and African American Studies. My own work in terms of civic responsibility, or the ways in which my own work on 18th century Black Atlantic literature connects to our topic for tonight, is that my work looks at slave narratives. And slave narratives are one of the first places where we see some of the effects of civic responsibility, right? Where the function of reading the slave narratives was intended to give people a sense of the necessity, right, for changing the oppressive laws surrounding enslavement in the United States. Let me turn to my left and introduce Adam Hussein, who is an associate professor of philosophy and religion here. And he is coming to us from the University of Colorado. And then next to him is Gordana Rabinovich, who's an associate professor of sociology and director of the Britnick Center on Violence and Conflict. And then next to Gordana is Shalonda Baker, who is professor of law and public policy and urban affairs at the law school, and she's also in CSSH. She's also an affiliate faculty member at Northeastern's Global Resilience Institute. We're going to begin by giving each panelist about 5 minutes to engage with the topic, and then we will, I'll bring the panelists together, we'll have some comments, we'll exchange some commentary, and then we'll open it up to the audience for your questions. So Adam, would you like to begin?
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Super. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. Thank you all for coming out. I was asked to talk about dislocation, and so what I thought I would talk about is political dislocation, the sense that some people have of being shut out from the political process in this country. And I wanted to talk about two different forms of, two different ways in which people might be shut out from that process. One, most straightforwardly, that they might be prevented legally from simply casting a ballot. But I also want to talk about, a little more subtly, some ways in which there are psychological barriers at times to political participation. And I'll talk through a few examples. So the first example I wanted to talk about, maybe one of the most obvious, is voter ID laws. So these laws were intended to reduce the problem of fraud at the ballot, but it seems that there was very little evidence of such fraud, and their practical effect was to prevent a lot of people from being able to vote, and they fell especially hard on poorer Americans, African Americans, and Latinx Americans. Now, there's one straightforward way in which voter ID laws shut people out. They simply make it more difficult for them to cast a ballot if they find it hard to get the relevant kind of ID. But there's also a psychological aspect even to those laws, where if people can reasonably infer that these laws are made precisely to prevent them from exercising their political voice, then they can reasonably be discouraged from trying to exercise their vote and engage in political speech and so on. A second example, campaign finance. So a series of cases, beginning with Buckley versus Vallejo, running through Citizens United and Speech Now, have altered the campaign finance structure in the United States, the way in which we fund elections. So one part of our current situation is that campaigns are funded in large part through money spent by wealthy donors. And then we also have a system where super PACs run a kind of shadow campaign parallel to the official campaigns. And they can be funded through individual donations and from corporations, and it's possible now to spend an unlimited amount in donating to those groups. Now, there's a lot of political science discussing just how much effect unlimited spending has on political outcomes. But I also want to suggest that in this situation, it would be reasonable for the average American to assume that their voice doesn't count as much. It would be reasonable for them to assume that candidates will be more beholden to the wealthier donors that they take their money from, and to those who spend via these super PACs that, as I said, operate as a kind of parallel campaigning force for candidates. So here, too, we have a potential kind of psychological barrier to political participation, where people might feel discouraged from participating in the political process because they feel that government won't take their interests and voice seriously. The last example I wanted to talk about, a little bit more closely related to a lot of work that I've done, is racial profiling. So, and especially I'll talk about racial profiling of Muslim Americans and people from, if you like, Muslim backgrounds in the United States, people whose ethnicity is associated with Islam, such as Arab Americans and various South Asian Americans and so on. So, in the wake of 9/11, we've seen substantial racial profiling of people from Muslim backgrounds. For example, the FBI and the NYPD reached out at various points to the Muslim community in New York and said, well, if we're going to deal with terrorism, we need to do it in a collaborative way, so we should have some community building exercises. But it turned out that frequently those community building exercises were in fact just there to allow the FBI to covertly wiretap and survey various community leaders in New York. So in that context, we have a situation where people from Muslim backgrounds can reasonably distrust the government and reasonably be worried that if they engage in political activism, if they're critical of the government, they will get in trouble. That if they're not if they are permanent residents or other immigrants, that they might be denied the ability to naturalize, or that in the worst case scenario, they might even be detained. So here too, we have barriers that are not strictly formal legal barriers that say you just can't engage in political speech or you can't cast a vote necessarily, but these more subtle psychological barriers. Now, the mere fact that somebody distrusts the government doesn't itself mean there's an injustice. Maybe they distrust the government for no good reason. But in the examples that I've given, I think we have a situation where there are reasons to distrust the government or even fear the government that are reasonable, where people have legitimate concerns. So just to close up, I think we should, when we think about the problem of political participation in this country, we need to look both at some formal legal barriers to political participation. We also need to build a process of regaining trust between the government and poor Americans and communities of color in the United States. Thank you.
Well, I'm next. In my remarks, I will address some of the challenges that we face today and remedies to address them. I'm speaking as a community sociologist who spent her career researching ways to create more inclusive, supportive, and just communities. My insights are informed also by my personal history. I came to this country in 1984 from the country of Yugoslavia. Anybody remember that country? Oh yeah, good. It does not exist anymore. The disintegration of my native country was very painful to me. From afar, I watched the escalation of civil conflict into violence and devastation brought to people that I know and loved. Tens of thousands of people died before the fighting stopped. So no wonder I actually researched those issues. And as a director of Brodnik Center and mission of our center, it's really to look into the way to actually prevent those things from happening. We look into disruption between conflict escalating to violence, and I think that's very important to consider, because conflict necessarily are not bad. Actually, they're useful because allow us opportunity to talk about difficult issues. What are the source of intergroup conflict and how they have potential to destroy our communities? One source of conflict, it's over scarce resources, such as jobs, land, goods, and services, as well as capital that we use for investment and development. Another source of conflict is perceived of real mistreatment of one group of people by another, and it's experienced as oppression and discrimination. A third source of conflict is around competing values and systems that associated identities that threaten our understanding of the world. We may think about these sources as economic, political, and cultural. They divide us and create categories of us and them. Us provides individuals with a sense of security and trust. Them we see as a source of our fears and problems. Just see what's happening in Europe right now, in Austria, in Germany, in France. You will see some of those elements. We see this division between us and them not only in our public sphere, such as political discourse and mass media, but also increasingly in our social lives via social media in a manner that may amplify our fears, but it's also less transparent and less subject to the scrutiny of established societal rules and norms. What remedies can we use to address the region of fears and conflict? And for me, I believe the concept of justice is important. The way I understand it, justice must be based on a concept of justice for all. We all have rights as individuals, and those rights have to be protected by our political and legal system, as well as by moral and value systems. But individual rights are not the only rights. We also have collective rights. Throughout our history, we fought for both of those rights. As we think about justice for all, we are thinking about the right to live in a safe and healthy communities, the right to have to receive decent wages, the right to participate in the political process and receive legal protection from abuse, violence, and discrimination. We also are talking about rights to practice different religions, speak different languages, and hold different political views. But what unites us is the concept that we should all have rights to be treated with dignity and fairness. That includes the right to participate in the process of defining what dignity and fairness are. It defines our civic responsibilities and provides the foundation for a civic society. Ultimately, justice for all is in our common interest and should be a key factor in how we are able to articulate our common interests and mobilize around them. And that's what I will continue to fight for.
I want to thank the organizers for allowing me to be a part of this incredible night. And I'm so happy to follow the last presentation, which discusses justice for all. So I'll start with a question. What does climate change expose? What does climate change expose? I have my list of things, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to engage in a conversation about that very question. But based on my research and based on current events, we can see that climate change disproportionately impacts the poor, disproportionately impacts communities of color, and those who have been excluded from decision-making around where they live. Climate change exposes the legacy of decision-making around housing and the design of our energy system. Climate change exposes vulnerabilities for the poor and for elderly when power outages create food, water, and medicine shortages. But climate change also exposes a phenomenal opportunity for a complete transformation of our energy system. It creates an opportunity for justice and justice for all. I work generally in the area of energy justice. It's an umbrella term that refers to the just transition away from an energy system in which we rely on fossil fuels that create the problem of climate change to one that is clean. And there are still a lot of questions around what a just energy system will look like. But many scholars like myself are sort of grappling with what the transition to a just energy system should look like. Energy justice incorporates several principles that you may have heard about over the last few years. Environmental justice is one of the areas under the broader umbrella of energy justice. So environmental justice addresses the legacy that I mentioned at the outset regarding the disproportionate impact of energy development on certain communities, particularly poor communities that are often in the cheapest, or housed on the cheapest land that they can afford, and many power plants and other facilities are housed in those communities. Environmental justice works to remediate that. And there is a body of literature addressing that disproportionate impact and that historical burden on specific communities. Energy justice also incorporates the idea of climate justice. So I started by asking, what does climate change expose? We know that climate change will disproportionately impact the poor. For many reasons, that's the case. Climate change will disproportionately impact those in the global south who, for many of whom, they had nothing to do with creating the problem of climate change. So in many communities, there isn't electricity. So again, they're reliant on the same fossil fuel economy that led to the problem of climate change. Climate justice works to remediate that and works to allow for communities to adapt to climate change, specifically those vulnerable communities to adapt to climate change in ways that make them more resilient. Energy justice also incorporates the idea of energy democracy. And so here we're talking about civic engagement. We're talking about ways in which communities can be involved in the conversation. Adam mentioned immigration. Energy democracy is a form of participation in creating the energy future. You might be wondering what that looks like. Maybe you've seen a rooftop solar panel. Maybe you've heard of community energy. Energy democracy is about allowing people to have control over their energy system, to generate their own energy, and eventually drive down the cost of their electricity. The last portion of energy justice, and again, this is an emerging and developing field, is economic justice. Economic justice is a way of thinking about remedying the prior harms that many communities have faced and been excluded, or with respect to being excluded from the economy at large. Energy justice and allowing communities to create their own energy, to own their own energy, can lead to economic justice, can drive down the cost of electricity for those who pay disproportionately high portions of their income to pay for their electricity bills. So climate change exposes all of this injustice, but also provides an opportunity to create a new system that is founded on the principles of justice. And I'm excited about it. I hope you're excited about it. I mean, you get to be in college at a time when our entire energy system is being redesigned. We often think of energy as a purely technical enterprise, but justice is deeply embedded in the way that we create our energy system. I'll end there.
Excellent. So we've heard some interesting and really compelling arguments and remarks about the various aspects of civic responsibility. And now we want to turn to a couple of our organizing questions and have the panelists talk with each other about how they see what is at stake in terms of each discipline and each topic. So the large questions that we began with is, how do we articulate values in a world of dislocation, disaster, and technological change? And then the second question is, what are responsibilities to one another in smaller and larger communities? And I think I'd like to add to this also the role of social media, right, in this question of civic engagement. In December, there was an article in the HuffPost about the relationship between the two, and drawing or highlighting the fact that many people engaged in social media, of that percentage of people who are online pretty frequently, right, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, they are more likely to engage in activities associated with civic responsibility, right? But then we also have, as we know, trolls and, right, what we could call, right, the balkanization as well going on. So I'm wondering if each of you might respond to either the larger question or the more specific question about social media in terms of your earlier remarks. And maybe if you could also talk to each other across. I liked Shalanda picking up on Gordana's engagement with Justice for All, particularly.
Maybe I can ask a question about so thanks so much, Shalanda. That was really interesting. I just wanted to ask about the relationship between energy democracy, which usually when we think about democracy, we're imagining people within one nation state participating in the country's institutions. But as you said, the problem of climate change really crosses national boundaries. And so I thought with some of these questions about civic responsibility across communities, I wondered how we might think about energy democracy in a way that might include voices from across political boundaries.
Yeah, so there are barriers to participation, right? So even in our democratic system as we kind of conceive of it, there are barriers to participation, whatever those may be. You talked about some of those in your remarks. With respect to energy, it's such a technical field. I mean, I didn't start with energy because I didn't want anyone to walk out of the room. I know that many eyes glaze over when you talk about energy. So people, it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. The lights come on, so you don't think about it as anything that that you should even be involved in with respect to the decision making. So for me, in my work, one of the challenges is making legible the aspects of energy that relate to justice. And so, Nicole, you started by kind of asking about social media. I'll kind of take a little bit of a detour on that, but the web itself, I probably just dated myself by saying the web, but the internet provides a tool whereby communities can engage and get the resources they need to participate in particularly designing their energy future. So I just came from the University of Hawaii and participated in creating a web-based tool where communities can actually go and learn about the energy policy landscape in Hawaii and then learn why it matters and why they should have their voice heard as the energy system is being designed. But the barriers are tremendous, and that's part of the work, because the lights go on until they don't, right? And we see that in Puerto Rico and around the world.
Well, I would like to kind of address that a little bit through this, again, go back to former Yugoslavia. Nikola Tesla, you know who Nikola Tesla is? Not the Tesla, the car, but Nikola Tesla. Well, Nikola Tesla believed that electricity should be free. That was a long time ago, that before we have solar panels, he says electricity is a resource all around us. We should not charge people for electricity. Wrong country, wrong place. If you can make money, why should you make electricity free? And so one thing that we are constantly having to struggle is this, we are trying to build a sustainable world. We are talking about as our necessity, and environmental and climate change are really a big part of it. But on another hand, we have people who think short term about the ability to make money now. Who cares what the future is going to be when I can get wealthy now? And so I think that's part of it, our individual versus our collective. So we are thinking about what's good for the planet. It's not necessarily good for individuals. And so this is the sets of new norms and values that we have to think about that will put collective as an important part of making this decision. Not that everything to have to be collective, but if you only think about yourself, if you never think about other people, how can we actually solve problems? And I think that issue between finding the balance between individual and collective is really important as we try to think about how to create this more just world.
Well, I could maybe just say a little bit about social media since it's come up. In philosophy, when we think about civic engagement, there are some relatively high-minded ideals that people have. Philosopher Jürgen Habermas said that in a democracy there should be no force, but the force is the greater argument. The idea is that in a democracy you don't push people around and try to get them to sign onto your view through manipulation or coercion or something like that. And there's a worry that the state of our discussion in this country, partly as a result of social media, is quite far from that ideal, where we have people trying to maybe not even convince each other at all, but when they are trying to convince each other, not through trying to appeal to their reason. And I don't know the solution to that at all, but I thought maybe that's something to raise for you folks. How do we build a kind of background trust between people and a sense of community that would allow us to have a more respectful dialogue with each other?
So relatedly, I'm wondering if Gordana and Shalanda, if you would like to add your comments about whether, right, just building off of Adam's comment here about social media's impact in terms of civic responsibility, right? So there is this conception that people want to argue that social media is enhancing, right, civic responsibility. So it's allowing more people to connect. Larger groups of people or smaller communities are able to feel as though they're part of a larger community by connecting online, these kinds of things, right? So it enhances certain connections. But at the same time, there are those who want to argue that it actually ruins understandings of, right, civic responsibility, that if you are alone in your room, right, with the laptop, that it's, that's not really community. So given that, right, we're always, or at least recently, we seem to keep talking about social media in terms of civic responsibility. I'm wondering how you want to weigh in on this
this question. Is it infinitely more complicated than that? Is it, it is simply black and white? How do you want to see this question?
So,
lawyers.
so I mean, it's always, I think, more complicated. With respect to the recent spate of disasters that we've seen in the last few weeks, I think social media played a vital role. It allowed those who felt isolated to connect. And I'll tell a personal story here. So during the first hurricane, Harvey, I have family in both Texas and Florida. So I was hit with Harvey, and then my family was hit with Irma just a week later. But I was scouring the news for information, and as a climate change energy scholar, I was really fascinated by energy and sort of the implications of what was happening. I came upon an article in the New York Times, and I mean, everything was happening so fast, but the article had sort of a compilation of videos taken from social media. And one of the videos was my brother. And it was devastating to me. He was talking about the water coming up and that they needed help. And they were eventually rescued, but I think social media can be a very powerful tool. And in terms of civic responsibility, it's one way to connect. It's one way for us to know when things are being underreported. Another example is, the fires in Northern California. I have connections there, and people are reporting that the smoke is really intolerable and that there are no masks available. And I read the New York Times cover to cover almost every day, and that's not really a part of the conversation. So I think social media can be used as a tool, but of course there are downsides to that too.
Well, certainly. Yeah, certainly I think it can democratize by giving people opportunity to be part of the discussion, because that's a part of it that we need to do, is how we're going to get multiple voices to participate in this, debates about what's important to us and what shall we address and what's really happening. Because in some places they might be suffering in isolation. If people do not know about that, it's very hard to address. I did, as a community sociologist, I did a lot of work on grassroots organizing, how people organize on a local level. One thing I learned from there is that if it wasn't in some type of media, it didn't happen. And therefore, it's very important that you have media involved. At that time, it was not social media, it was paper media. That means you need to get journalists to come and cover the event. And today, we actually can have that coverage through social media because you can put them on YouTube, or you can put them someplace other people can see. And this is kind of issue of trust. And I think that's very important about what shall we trust, and how can we trust it. And as some of my students know, I already talk about that all the time. Well, we cannot trust anything if you think that way. That means there is no truth. But you're looking from convergence of evidence. You're looking how these different things all can converge in order for you to know what really happened. And therefore, social media is important in converging it, in telling us what's really going on. But it also that we, if you think about trust, is that we trust many things. We trust, Uber. We go and take a, drive for people that we don't know. We go to Airbnbs and we sleep in people's houses that we don't know. We do so many different things. We go and eat in restaurants just based on what we read in, Yelp evaluation. So in a sense, we have a lot of opportunity to build trust. And I who live in urban areas all my life and feel safe in urban, I don't feel safe in suburbs. Nobody, people tell me I have a wrong perception, and I say, yeah, people live in cities. I trust people, suburbs, animals, all these kind of things. Thank you. I always go with people instead of others. But I'll tell you how many times these total strangers came and helped me. I don't know them, they don't know me, they just saw me struggling and they came and helped. And so part of that, yes, we could trust strangers through, many different, those crowdsourcing economies. So we have this capacity. The question is that how we can create around that trust, and how can we build the trust around things that's really important to us. And I think it is this common interest. That's another thing that what is our common interest, and how can we organize around that common interest?
just want to kind of ask Adam a question based on his work. So, in light of the comments regarding trust, right? How do you build community, and how do you build sort of a common language of understanding with some of the things we're seeing regarding immigration and some of the legal means and others that are used to exclude?
And particularly given the atmosphere of such intense distrust, right, between law enforcement agencies and people of Muslim background, right?
Yeah, thank you. And so I do think the problem of trust is real, and Gordana mentioned some really important ways that I hadn't even thought of as much with respect to the media. One way that we traditionally maybe try to solve that problem is by having a sense of community of some kind within the country, and so one way to try to move forward would be to think, well, how can we build some bonds of solidarity across people that where we try to think of ourselves as one big community. But that's a difficult project because on the one hand, when we look back, older conceptions of that community were pretty exclusionary. Often we had a conception of the community as really just being property white men, for instance. So what direction do we go in? And one answer traditionally has, one other kind of line of thought has been, well, what we should do is just kind of organize around a set of ideals. So we can just say, well, even if we're not all the same ethnicity and we're not from the same, or the same race, or we even have the same views on politics, we're members of different parties, still we can kind of coalesce around, say, the Constitution. But it's not clear that we can even do that anymore, given how different people's views are and what the Constitution means. And it's not clear if that way of thinking about community builds bonds that are sufficiently strong to hold us together and build trust. So I think there's a real question there. How do we have a conception of community that is thick enough for people to really care and identify with each other, but isn't exclusionary in some way, in the way in which we've seen past conceptions of community and of the nation be? So again, I don't know the answer to that, but I would love to hear your thoughts on how we can move forward with that.
And on that note, we'd like to turn to the audience to invite you to ask questions of the panelists. We have two folks with mics. If folks have questions for us up here.
So the title of this talk is Civic Responsibility, and I noticed that in a number of speakers' remarks, people talked about civic engagement. And I was just wondering whether you thought that there was any difference or whether there's a relationship between the two.
So I was at a conference over the weekend, and one of the folks who put on the conference was reading a book called A Generation of Sociopaths. Have you heard about it? Who just heard about it? So the argument, I think the principal argument in the book is that the baby boomers, not to offend anyone, this is the argument in the book, the baby boomers have left the next generations with disasters, and that they had made decisions at every turn to maximize their own wealth and their own generation's well-being at the expense of future generations. And so I'm excited to read this book, but it sort of responds in a way to your question, I think, because it's not. I think civic engagement is a responsibility, and I think, for those who sort of have watched as some of the decision-making has happened around climate policy, around, again, the design of our energy system, systematic sort of exclusion of certain folks from our economic system over time, those who watched without participating, without having a voice in that process, I think they're responsible. They're just as culpable as those who actively design the system. And so I think moving forward, engagement is sort of, it's a requirement, and it's part of our responsibility, our collective responsibility.
I'm not going to, rather than kind of answer that question, maybe I'll just kind of explore two views about that and see what people think. I think on one pretty common view, people think, well, in a democratic system, your job as an individual is to promote your interests and the interests of people that share your community or whatever. And the democratic system just involves a kind of fair fight between people trying to get their interests promoted. But there's another way to think about things where, no, your job in participating is not just to advance your own interests or the ones that you identify with, but to think about the common good. And so I think, if you think about things the first way, then engagement doesn't involve a responsibility for thinking about the whole. It just involves a responsibility for thinking about yourself and trying to at least play fair. Whereas if you think about things in the second way, then yes, there's this close alignment between civic engagement and civic responsibility, because the form that civic engagement should take really involves looking out not just for yourself, but for ideals of justice and the common good. So I guess I would just open up these different ways of thinking about it.
Yeah, I will talk about this example that just happened a couple of months ago. I had a friend who is a professor at the Queen's University in Belfast, and she was meeting me in Dublin. So she was taking a train from Belfast, where she is, to Dublin. And when she arrived, she was there with a couple that I didn't know. And turned out the couple was there just to escort her from the train because they want to make sure she was right. What happened in the train, she was harassed by a 12-year-old boy. She is an Asian woman, not very tall, and this climb of anti-immigrant sentiment and importance of this nativist culture in Belfast empowered this 12-year-old boy to harass this 40-year-old woman. And this couple were bystanders. They're people who just who are sitting next to her. And what they did, they did something. They told the boy that this is not right and he could not behave the way they did. And then they make sure that she was fine. So they stayed with her until she got out of the train. And I think that's part of civil responsibility. When you see injustice happen, that you actually do something about it. That doesn't mean that you have to endanger yourself. But if, decent people will not act, then you will create this acceptance for this unacceptable behavior. And this is it's not to say that what this boy did was so unusual, but it does tells you something about the culture that's developing in Belfast right now, in the whole political kind of atmosphere that actually empower people who feel that they have a right to demand certain type of respect just because they see themselves as native-born, Irish citizen of that place. And so, it happened in other places, but I just want to use this as one of the examples that, in a sense, it can happen to anyone, and it happened to many people, and it doesn't always happen. It is kind of civility, if you will, that civil breakdown of some type of civility that can bring these issues up. And again, if we act, we can stop it. If we don't, if it gets unchecked, it can grow and it can become more disruptive. And so that's, I think, part of that responsibility of our civic responsibility to our fellow citizens, fellow people that we see and who at some point need our help.
Yeah, I mean, a significant component of civic responsibility and civic engagement, I would argue, is empathy, right? Is being able to feel for another person, being able to put yourself in another person's shoes. One of the ways that we are able to do that in a pretty facile way is through reading, right? You literally put yourself in someone else's shoes when you're reading from their perspective in a novel. I want to just briefly mention Mohsin Hamid's recent novel, Exit West. I'm not sure if folks have read that. It came out last year, and it's about immigrants. But the difference is that, migrants. But the difference is that rather than focusing on migrants who are, moving on trains and far away in these transportation nodes, instead, people move from place to place by these series of magical realist doors that would be in your house or in your, in a hotel or an apartment, that kind of thing. And so what that does, the function of that that image, right? So migrants moving across the globe, not by going on planes or trains, which are pretty distant, right? But by having them show up in your house, right? One day, it makes that experience of migration much more intimate, right? Much closer, and the questions it raises in terms of civic responsibility, right, and civic engagement. What are your responsibilities to migrants if they're not over there, right, but they're literally in your house? Questions from the audience? There's one back there. While we're waiting, I thought maybe we could talk about the role of higher education in dealing with these questions of civic responsibility, right? We're here at Northeastern. Yep.
Hi. Excuse me. Hi, my name is Charles Wallace Thomas. I am a first year studying mechanical engineering and minoring in law and public policy. And my question for the professors today has to do with that question of how we build a community or in a community of trust. So the social psychologist Daniel Batson talks about collectivism, egoism, principalism, and altruism as motives for pro-sociality. So in thinking about civic engagement and how we're not only engaged, but pro-socially engaged, do you guys have any thoughts about how we combine those motives most effectively?
Well, when we think about building the community, we actually think about common interests, something that we share and we want to see to fruition. And I think it's I'll again give you an example. When I was working on my book, I wanted the title of the book to be "Defending the Community." And somebody else actually published the book with some title, and now I was out of the title, so I have to think about what else I'm going to do. And luckily for me, that was taken because my new title was Community Builders. And actually, I kind of moved from that one, Defending the Community, which actually is more reactive. So we're thinking about that our communities are under attack of some sort. And in my case, it was urban communities which were facing really degradation and problems, and it was how we gonna kind of protect the place where we live. So thinking of community as your home. But building community actually built from our strength. And start thinking about what do we have in common, how can we actually bring things together. And I'll argue that we actually survive as a human race because we work together. And this is the issue of cooperation and trying to really kind of collaborate in some way. And so we might think about community in a spatial, in urban sociology where I am, often the community is a spatially thing. And that's very important where people live. But there is something else close, again, community of interest, when people who share similar interests, not similarity as socioeconomic characteristics, but things that they like. You like opera, and there are not many people in your community who like opera, but now on the internet you have people who like opera and you can share with that. And they're total strangers that you can actually get in contact around this interest. So again, this issue of trust around this kind of commonalities. So I think we belong to different type of communities. It's not just one community that we're going to be one. We have one of our professional communities, and we feel good, among people that share the same language of our profession. And then we have, people that will, live together, or people from our ethnic groups. So we have several different communities, and I think that nature that we can have an interrelation between these different communities. But one of the concepts that I find useful is the issue of interdependence. And it is this felt that we had to depend on each other. And once we realize of this interdependence, I think that this is something that can get us, this kind of push toward thinking about others, not just about ourselves.
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments. I'm not familiar with that literature, but I can sort of provide some perspective from the energy and climate standpoint. So, of course, we saw with Hurricane Harvey, the Cajun Brigade, I can't remember the exact name of it, but communities coming together to rescue their neighbors. And, putting together through social media the network so that folks would be safer and would be saved at the height of the storm. So without there being a disaster, occurring, there are ways for folks to engage around community, energy, and climate in ways that are not high pressure. So climate action planning is one way to do that, as well as community energy planning. And I think, again, I'm the least sexy topic in some ways, because people don't think about these things until the lights go off or until the storm hits. But this is a way to engage in a conversation with policymakers and a way to engage with your neighbors to determine who's vulnerable. What do we do when the power goes out? And in places like New York, for example, with Sandy, when Hurricane Sandy hit, there was no water able to flow in those high rises. So people were not only without power, but also without water. And of course, elderly folks and people that were already vulnerable were even more vulnerable in the face of Sandy. So climate action planning would say, okay, let's make sure those people are actually safe, and let's make this entire community more resilient. So you get to know your neighbors, you get to know them through this planning process. Community energy planning is a way for folks to engage and say, what do we want our energy future to look like? They've done it in places like Kodiak, Alaska, in Vermont, and other communities that are really interested in becoming resilient and less reliant on fossil fuels. So at a very technical level, there are ways to create community through the planning process. But of course, I like the spatial idea as well. Yeah.
Great.
Sorry.
Do you want to?
That's such a great question. Thank you. I'm not a sociologist or a psychologist, so, but as a philosopher, I guess I would say you could see the problem is something like this. So we know that people are motivated by their identities. They do things because they say, well, I am this kind of person. But then there's this problem that in a large heterogeneous society, we don't want people just to act on kind of narrow identities so that they ignore other people's interests. And so on the one hand, we want people to care about bigger ideals like freedom and equality, but we also need them to not just think of those as abstractions, but in some way to identify with them. We need them to say, like, it's part of who I am, that I care about equality, that I care about liberty. And so that's sort of one way maybe to see the puzzle.
So I saw a lot more questions. So why don't we take 2 questions and then, yes.
Yes, quick comment and question. I believe that love, well, let me put it this way. I believe that no justice, no peace. Or if we know justice, we know peace. And in that context, right here on campus, there's a block of community time that's heard right here on the local campus radio station, WRBB 104.9 FM. And about 3 weeks ago, a long-standing program on that Sunday community block, which had been here with WRBB for decades, was summarily just taken off the air. There was a letter, there was no review, and the reason given by the person who had that discretion was allegedly that there was hate speech. And the incident, which happened 3 weeks ago, was that Minister General Ahmed, who does the Sons of Africa program for decades on WRBB, had on as a guest a person who was discussing the social justice issues surrounding our Jewish and Palestinian brothers and sisters. And right away, there was an accusation of hate speech. I strongly would have to disagree with that. I don't think that that was anywhere the letter or the spirit of what that was about. But now that programming and that underserved community is gone, and there are folks from around the world who are connecting with it online, and I feel that we all miss out on that. So how should that be addressed right here on campus, which I believe is a grave injustice in terms of shutting down a very important dialogue? And thank you for this opportunity.
Great. Thank you. So that a great question, which gets back to one of our organizing questions, right? So how do we articulate values, right, and manners? Just came from a class on Jane Austen, so you'll have to forgive me for bringing in manners. But right, I think that's what the question is engaging in, right? So how are we going to engage with respectful engagement with people who think differently than us? Can we get one more question? in the back.
Hi, my name's Sharina. I'm a fourth year nursing major here at Northeastern. A few of the things that you touched on really, I resonated with as someone who works in the healthcare industry. It's an extremely large industry with a lot of profit that tends to, cause a lot of victimization of groups that are marginalized. Adam, you talked about, super PACs, the power of people with money. Shalonda, you talk about, the industry of energy and how right now the fossil fuel industry is extremely productive in making a profit. And I feel like as someone working in the healthcare industry, there are so many things where people are making profits and things where maybe they shouldn't be. For example, drugs that, are life-saving. Do you feel that a lot of your goals, as people who could influence changes in policy and beliefs, do you think some of those goals and motives that you have are hindered by the capitalistic society that we currently live in? Or do you see it as, are you able to find solutions to the way that our current economy works?
Wonderful, thank you. So 2 great questions, I think. So the first question of values and how we are articulating values and manners, how we are evaluating. And then the second question about the impact of money, on these goals for civic responsibility. So I'll ask the panelists to respond to one or both questions.
Sure. Maybe I'll say something about the last question. Thanks so much for that question. I'm not an expert on healthcare by any means, although my sister works at the Brigham, so that's my main point of contact. But your question brings up, I think, this general problem of in American politics of having some confidence that I tried to allude to a little bit in my initial remarks of having some confidence that various areas of policy are being made in a way that is reflective of the interests of the community at large and different people's views. And healthcare, I think, is certainly an example. And it's really a bipartisan issue, I think it's fair to say, of where there's concern that special interests are getting an outsized role. And like I say, I don't see it necessarily as a capitalist versus socialist or any other. I think people who have all kinds of different views about how the economy ought to be run can reasonably be concerned that their views are not getting properly represented in the political process. So there's an alliance here between Tea Party people on the right and people on the left who have the same concern about not being able to exercise an effective political voice.
I think it's also a great question and great comment as well in the back. I think we're here in this space to create an atmosphere of civility and to be able to talk about difficult issues. So I'm happy to be a part of this conversation, and I'm delighted that I was invited. So with respect to the capitalist question, that is one particular lens through which to view the energy transition. So without getting too in the weeds on what's happening with the energy transition, utilities are certainly looking around and wondering what their business model will look like now that people are able to generate electricity from their rooftops and own that power and get a credit for generating that power. But it doesn't have to be the end of the story. So if we are only focused on the sort of rhetoric around capitalism and around sort of the economics of the energy transition, we won't get far. But there is an interesting convergence, and you sort of talked about that a little bit as well. I mean, there are some some interesting convergences happening around energy, in particular, energy security, right? No one liked to see the long lines of people waiting to get gas in Florida. I mean, that in many ways put people in harm's way in ways that the storm did not. And so by creating a cleaner grid where people can actually charge their cars, where we create incentives for people to own electric vehicles, for example, that's security, and that's nonpartisan. There is a role for the utility in the future. You're right to sort of suspect that the reason why we have the system we have is because of profits being extracted based on that system. That is true. But there's a transition that's going to happen because people want to be secure. And there's a transition that's going to happen from the bottom because people want to own energy. And so hopefully we can have a conversation, right? and that those don't have to be, that those sides don't have to completely be in tension with the transformation of the energy system.
About 2 more questions.
Thank you. Shalanda, I think I know that some of your research has been about the interface between the kind of national drive to reinvent the energy system in Mexico and how that's affecting indigenous communities, their rights, their conception of themselves, et cetera. And I hate to let you get out of here without reflecting a little bit on what that relationship, what the response of those ancient communities to this situation has to say to us about this question of civic responsibility. From what I know of those communities, I believe they would kind of scratch their head in a little bit at this notion of individual civic responsibility as we're talking about it here. So is there anything to say that doesn't require a whole other lecture that about what you're learning from that brings to this discussion?
Kevin, you should take my class, spring of 20.
I wish I had the time.
2018. No. So briefly, though, I think it's a great question. I think there's a danger in sort of painting with broad strokes what the indigenous community is, right? I mean, we talked about what community is and how that's difficult to discern as well. In my research, there has been some difficulty in determining what the unified voice is with respect to indigenous people on the ground. Now, we know that there is an international legal framework that supports the rights of indigenous people, and many advocates have fought to ensure that the rights of indigenous people are protected when we're thinking about energy development. Many of the people that I have engaged and many of the folks that write about this talk about indigenous communities simply wanting a seat at the table. Now, there will be those who want development. There will be those who want to see the development happen in the way that we see it happen in the West or the global North. And there will be those who want nothing to do with that. But without even asking, first, you're running afoul of international doctrine. And second, you're missing an opportunity to learn from folks who have been in a certain region for generations. So I don't want to assume or presume to understand what indigenous people want, but I will continue to write about and continue to sort of advocate for them to have a seat at the table so that we can learn from those communities.
We'll take another question, but while we're waiting, I think it's key in responding to one of the earlier questions, definitions, right, in terms, right? So how we are defining civic responsibility, how we are defining hate speech, right? How we are even defining a term such as community, right, will impact our engagement with these questions as well. Yes.
First, I'm Lori Lefkowitz, I teach here, and I want to thank my colleagues for modeling civil discourse and raising so many important issues. I want to ask about civil discourse and civic responsibility and the place of passion for values and expressions of that passion as educators on the one hand, and on the other side, the ways in which our culture is raising all kinds of fears that are creating policies that are quite contrary to the shared assumptions of everybody in the front of the room. I mean, I guess what's behind my question is that, you know, Gordana, your statement that that it's in everybody's interest for there to be justice for everybody. I agree with that, and I think it's, you know, it seems like a self-evident statement. We talk about, and we want a clean climate, but here we are, and we're pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, and we are, supporting the coal industry, and by we I mean the powers that be. Nationalism is on the rise. That little boy was empowered on the train because his fears have been stoked as that of the people who raised him, and he also feels a certain kind of entitlement. And I'm pissed, and I want to know what my job is as a teacher and how to promote civil discourse in my classes in a way that will allow everybody to speak. And when we have these shared assumptions, are we shutting down a constituency that might have something different to say that I just don't understand?
Well, I don't want to sound Pollyannish, but I will say we have to think about long-term versus short-term. And short-term, this is the challenges that we are facing right now. And those challenges are real challenges, but that doesn't mean because we have those challenges that we should be depressed about it, because that's one of the things that it's, the part of trying to resolve it is to thinking how overwhelmed we are with some of those, problems that happen in a variety of ways. But then again, if you think long-term is what can we do in order to overcome it? And the question, this is what I learned actually by, studying poor people movements. How poor people survive was really a question, like they have so many obstacles in order to do that. And they survive because, they organize, they get together, they work together. And I think that's the notion of that community. And community organizing, social mobilization, it's around these shared values that we have. We have a power as to act, and that's what we actually do. And that's over time, you're always, going to see that. And this is this issue what I call about justice for all as a way of organizing. Talk about part of the discourse is, I don't need you to like me. I don't need you to love me. I don't care if, I like you to like me. But this is not what we're fighting for. I want you to recognize my rights. And I think that's the part of it, that I have rights. Not because you like me, but because I have, as a citizen, as someone who lives here, not citizen necessarily in a kind of legal terms, but as a resident of a particular place, as a fellow, human being, I have a right. And I think that type of going to our shared values. If we get to that as our value that we really care about, I think we can organize around it. That we can share, we can have different views, and we can disagree about many other issues. But that might be fundamental one that will get us that we are here together. My husband says that we are all on the same boat, and that part, it's not us and it's not them. It's only us. And you know what? If part of the world, collapse, we all collapse. So it's not like, I'm going to escape. Where are you going to go? Where are you going to, hide? And that part of understanding of that we are in the same boat, I think it's very important for us as we try to think about what we're going to do. But not for the question, it's good to have values. As I think about what is this value in people ask me because I am natural as American, and ask, what makes you proud to be American? And I say, well, it is this value of justice for all. Not every society has that. It's not like we actually live up to this ideal, by the way. We have a long way to go. But that is something that organizing is much better than, I have a right to own the home, which is, right too, or American dream that we're all going to get wealthy one day. That's certainly, part of that discourse that we have. But I think this kind of issue of the rights, and this is where you talk about legal kind of framework, which is important. So I think it's kind of keeping an eye on a ball, that yes, we have problems right now, but where we want to go, we can only go together. And I think that's part, which is important.
Just talking about the relationship between the classroom and the broader society, I do think that I see in the classroom the thing that I want to see more broadly, which is people from different backgrounds with very different views, making an effort to say, okay, I see the point you're making and why you're making it, and I don't agree with it, but here's why I don't agree. I don't just think you're wrong. And, it's hard and it doesn't always work, but it does give me some hope that it's at least possible. And the classroom is a very specific kind of environment. People are talking face to face, and they know each other somewhat. So, the extent to which it can be replicated at the global scale, I don't know, but it is one of the things that gives me some optimism, even though I'm not overall massively optimistic.
I'm reminded of the tremendous privilege that I have to be a professor, to be someone who, by an accident of birth, was born in the global north, right? And so when I get disheartened and discouraged by whatever may be happening around me, I realize that I have a responsibility to make the world better, and that also sounds Pollyanna-ish, because of my immense privilege, because of all the privileges I've amassed throughout the years. And so, and I think in the classroom, the goal is to seek truth, right? We're trying to understand what is true. And people are coming into the classroom with certain histories and baggages and different understandings of the world. And so in this little bubble, we all use our privilege and all use our backgrounds to try to figure out, at the end of the day, what is true. And I agree with Adam. You have to show why you believe what you believe, right? Is it in the text? Okay, how is it supported? I mean, in law, we are trying to sort of get students to think in a certain way. But I don't feel like I have a right to hold my head down, because there are many people in much worse positions than me who don't have the opportunity to do what I do. And every day, I'm gonna show up, I'm going to do what I do, and hopefully I'll, at the end of the day, make it a better place. So, I mean, that's the best advice. It's Pollyanna, but when you think about the rest of the world, we have to do that.
My name is Ruben. I'm a graduate student here at Northeastern. So when I think about civic responsibility on a global stage, I think that there's a lot of inequality that exists. You spoke about how climate change exposed a lot of these, and how the countries that tend to cause climate change are not the ones who are suffering because of it, right? And I feel that what civic responsibility, it means different things in different countries. Like in oil-producing nations, maybe producing oil and using oil gas is not a bad thing, and they all run by it. So it's not like they're not actively going to solve that problem. So because of this, the problem of climate change still stays a problem, because while we sitting here agree that it's a bad thing to, we should shift to clean energy, but there is another part of the world that doesn't believe so. So how do you think you move ahead and, get ahead of this?
So let me just make sure I understand your question. When you're talking about countries that don't necessarily believe that it's a problem, are you referring to, can you reframe that a little bit or clarify what you mean there? So
what I mean is, okay, civic responsibility means very different things in different countries, right? I just gave you an example of climate change in terms of energy, because I had that, like you were talking about it. And Adam spoke about a lot of special interests that affect a lot of these laws that are in place to affect change. Like here, the oil industries, they have a lot of sway when it comes to political decisions. So how do you, we have an agreed concept of civic responsibility that we talk about, but the definition itself varies when you look across the globe.
Right.
So, I mean, how do you move forward from there?
My gosh, that's a hard question, and I think that's part of the work that I'm doing. That's part of the work a lot of folks who work in the area of climate change and energy are trying to figure out. It is about balancing interests in some ways. I think the economy or the economics of energy might answer that question for us. So as solar gets cheaper, as it gets cheaper and more efficient to bring renewables online, we'll probably see the oil and gas industry, and perhaps, coal, a lot of coal companies are going out of business. We'll see that that shift happen within that discourse. But I think that it's a hard question. I mean, we have to sort of continually bring everyone to the table and think about the trade-offs. Think about sort of setting renewable portfolio standard goals that are incremental. And for example, in Hawaii, they've set a 100% renewable goal, so that by 2045, all of their energy needs to be met by, all their electricity need to be met by renewable energy. But that's incremental. And so, I think it will take time.
And certainly, right, although there are specifics, right, that will be very different in terms of the definition of civic responsibility. I think the essence, right, or at its base, at its most foundational elements, civic responsibility is about community, right? And so I think that element is similar wherever you go, right? This idea that that there is this larger group that you have some kind of responsibility to act towards or for or in concert with something along those lines. Because we could have the same conversation about human rights, right? That, technically, human rights are defined differently depending on, right, what context you are in. But luckily, the United Nations got together and they came to an agreement, right, in terms of these are, right, our shared understandings of what are our human rights.
I just want to comment as well. I mean, I think just kind of going back to Lori's question, there seems to be this sort of frustration around the possibility of there being a rogue actor. Like, what do you do with rogue players? What do you do when everyone doesn't share the same set of assumptions, right? And I don't know that we fully address that. But we do go back to first principles. I mean, I think kind of picking up on what Adam has said from the beginning, what are our shared values? And how do we sort of, I mean, even if we have that rogue actor, we kind of have to keep returning to that, I think. I mean, that's the best answer I have.
We have time for one last question, 2 last questions. Let's do that. No? Okay, yeah. Just one then.
Hi, everyone. It's Jack McDevitt, Associate Dean for Research in the college. I wanted to follow up on a couple of points you made. A little bit disconcerting, Gordon, but a faculty member in our college told me how she stepped in front of a Muslim woman today on the train to protect her from 2 kids that were harassing her on her way to Northeastern. So it comes back to today here in Boston that we're still dealing with those kind of issues. And while the internet has played such a great role in being able to allow us to find similar folks with similar ideals, it also is a place where people that Gordon and I study, hate offenders, find similar interests and are buoyed by their ability to find people who share their values. But I wanted to sort of bring it back at the end to Nicole's question and Lori's question about what do we do in school here? What do we do in this university? How do we handle this? And I think you all have modeled, the 4 of you have modeled a wonderful opportunity to present this in a subtle and contextual way. Here's my concern, and I'm putting it as a challenge to the students in the room. A large number of faculty on the campus are afraid of this conversation. They're not fully equipped to have it, and they restructure their classes to be able to say, how do we get through this topic without raising lots of problems in the classroom that I have to deal with? And I think that it's up to us and to the students to say, no, this is something we have to deal with. We don't have to get through this algorithm next, but we have to have a conversation that affects our lives at the same time. And to think a little bit about how we all can get our colleagues to bring this kind of a deeper conversation into the classroom as you have tonight.
Great question, Jack. Wow. Where do we even begin? Adam? Let's begin with the philosopher. That's always a good place to start, right?
Yeah, I could just say that I'm something very abstract that everyone can agree with. Thank you. What a hard and important question. I totally agree that these are hard things to teach, and I think that we should recognize that. And when we look at what people are doing on campus and say, I see that this is a different kind of class to teach. And I think maybe one thing that you alluded to that's true is that having these conversations work is partly the responsibility of the faculty, but it does take something from the students. It takes a certain amount of courage to hear stuff that is difficult to talk about, and faculty members have to recognize that certain people are especially vulnerable. But and then it also takes a willingness to listen, and so it does take a set of characteristics that depend on the nature of the community and what individuals are willing to do. And so I think that's something that we should just recognize for a start and not just assume that it's going to be easy. and then I don't have the answers to how to make it work. But I totally agree with you that we better be talking about it for a start. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'll bring an issue of families. Just we don't even have to talk about just think about your own families. How many families don't talk about difficult issues? And so we often avoid conflict. That's why I'm saying conflict is good, because it forces us to debate and discuss and come up with something. And so this is kind of conflict avoidance, get you to basically ignore things and hope that you'll never have to deal with that. And so the question is that eventually you'll have to. And the question is that might be a much bigger question. So the small problem might become a big problem. And so this is that courage. And courage we get only from trust also. You have to, part of that, if we work more on creating our classroom as more trusting places when people feel more comfortable. And it takes time. It's certainly we have academic goals, what the material we want to cover, and we are really interested in doing it, but at the same time, we have these other goals, which is creating a classroom as a trusting place when people feel comfortable discussing these difficult questions. And that's actually, a difficult one to do it, but not more difficult than one you have in your own home, by the way. And so I think it's on different level that we are facing it.
So I'm actually going to kind of flip the question a little bit and make it about students. Because I actually think students have tremendous power. And if they're not getting what they need from the institution and the conversation is not being had, then there needs to be some organizing around that. And there needs to be a conversation around that. I mean, I think this is part of that, right? But students are not only here to receive the information and sort of memorize and, put it into compartments. We're here to sort of ignite you, right? And you are living in one of the most challenging times ever. And you should get what you need from your professors. You should be able to be in a conversation that excites you. And so talk to us. And, and if the system is not working for you, then there needs to be a bigger conversation. And maybe I'm opening up a can of worms there, but the 60s, a lot of the Chicano studies and African American studies departments came out of a lack of a voice for certain students. And if people don't feel like they're getting what they need, then they have to sort of raise hell.
And on that note,